Before we start, if you want to try the game out, it's available to play in the browser, and there's a link to it in the description. So at this point I had two options. Either give up, or start figuring out what I'm gonna be able to get out of this. Yeah, you're not gonna make me give up that easily. So, I had the next 48 hours to design and make a game based on the theme every 10 seconds for the Ludum Dare 51 game jam, doing everything from the code to the assets and even the sound effects by myself. And the first thing I needed to do was to actually come up with a game. So my first idea was a game where you were on a road trip and your car would break down every 10 seconds, leading to a WarioWare style game where you had to pump gas or change a tire or piston head. But this seemed like it would take a lot of art to make, which isn't really my forte, and coding a bunch of very different situations would also take a long time, so I put the idea on ice. There were also a couple other ideas that didn't end up sticking, but the one I landed on that seemed the most plausible to make was a top-down shooter where you would switch between being able to move and being able to shoot every 10 seconds. There were some issues with committing to this though, as the other idea frankly sounded more fun, and I didn't want to waste time on something I'd later decide I didn't actually want to make. So I wasted that time procrastinating instead. At about 1 PM though, after watching a couple hours of YouTube while sinking deeper into the desperation of analysis paralysis, I decided I could either give up now or start coding. So the first thing I implemented was a simple player movement script, and because I thought that the movement state would be boring otherwise, I also added a dash. I decided that the player would be a robot that switched between movement mode and stationary turret mode every 10 seconds, and the enemies would be drones that would try to melee attack the player. The gameplay would then consist of trying to avoid the enemies in the movement state and mowing them down in the shooting one. After implementing the dash though, it didn't feel precise enough, since you could only really aim it in 8 directions on the keyboard, so I added the option to click the mouse to make it dash towards the cursor. This was better, but using both the mouse and keyboard for movement just felt a little unnatural, so I decided to try doing the movement using only the mouse. So now the player moved towards the cursor and dashed when you clicked the mouse, which isn't the most conventional control scheme, but it just felt so much better than before that I decided to stick with it. With the basics of movement down, I started implementing the turret mode. I made some simple enemies and gave the player a raycast that pointed towards the mouse. Whenever you clicked the mouse, the raycast would check if it was colliding with an enemy and delete the enemy if it was. I then added a button that would switch between the modes for testing purposes and made a simple shooting effect. Next I started implementing the basics of the enemy behavior, where they would basically, every second or so, choose randomly to either go straight towards the player, strafe around them, or go in a random direction. This is surprisingly pretty much how the enemies work in the final game, though they have a few more choices, and those choices are slightly different depending on if they can see the player or not. I also gave the enemies a dash attack that would trigger if they got close enough to the player. Now that I had all the basic game mechanics down, I started actually thinking about the structure of the game, and while I acknowledged that a single room game with enemies spawning from the edges would probably be the easiest to develop, I decided that was too boring and decided to instead make it something similar in spirit to a Zelda 1 dungeon. So I started making camera transitions that would lock to each room, and enemies that would only activate once the player entered their room, and then I improved the graphics. You might notice me bouncing between things while developing this game, and that's mostly because it's easy to tire yourself out doing high-focused tasks like coding for hours at a time, and switching things up gives the brain time to recharge. So I made a tile set for the floor and walls, and also added a shooting sound effect. I added a little bit of recoil to the shooting so that you could reposition at least a little while stationary, and this recoil actually became the canon reason to why the sentry can't move and shoot at the same time. As for the in-game reason to why there isn't just a button to switch between these modes, honestly I have no idea. After that I worked on the layout a little more. I added doors that could, for now, be opened and closed with a button, and I also added some practice dummies in the first and second rooms. This is where I ended day 1, and before going to sleep I had some time to take a step back and think about what the final product would be. At this point I realized that the concept of a Zelda-like dungeon with pre-placed enemies was wildly incompatible with the main mechanic, since there were many points where no enemies were on screen, and changing to the turret mode for 10 seconds in such places would stop the player in their tracks and completely break the pacing of the game. So I decided to scrap the different rooms and make it a single room where enemies would spawn randomly but constantly, the specifics of which I'd figure out later. This meant that changing into the turret mode would never be an inconvenience, as the player would never have a different room they needed to go to, and if there were no enemies, there was always a chance that more of them would spawn. So the next morning I removed the different rooms and created this simple arena, with doors at every edge and 2 walls so there would at least be some obstacles. I created a spawner that would randomly spawn an enemy behind one of the doors, and made the doors open, push the enemies in, and close automatically. The doors were originally made to be used by the player, and I was afraid I'd have to scrap them since there was only 1 room now, but I managed to repurpose them for the enemies in this way, and thinking back to it, I probably would have had to implement something very similar for them anyway. Next, I wanted to improve the shooting effects, so I added some screen shake, screen flash, particles, and a muzzle flash. When a mechanic or interaction is as central to your game as shooting is to mine, you should try to make it as satisfying to use as possible. All of the best jam games I've played have taken the time to make their central mechanics as enjoyable to use as possible, and there's nothing more sad than a game where the central mechanic feels incredibly bland. If you want to make jam games that include shooting, and you have to make the sounds of the game yourself, practice creating a shooting sound from a combination of sounds you can make, and look up some tutorials, so that when you actually have to do it in a jam, it sounds more like this than this. I then experimented on the layout a lot, and ended up with this formation of 6 blocks, which felt like it had a good amount of options for traversal, and suitable cover from the enemies. Next, I added a timer that would show the time before the next mode switch to the top left of the screen. This just confirmed my suspicion that the text would not be enough, and I would definitely need a bar of some sort. My first thoughts were a solid bar at the top of the screen, or a translucent screen-sized bar below all the objects and walls, which would change the color of the floor. The first option felt a little generic, and the second a little too busy. So I essentially combined the two, and created this frame on the edges of the floor. I then decided it would be a good idea to spend almost an hour making a sound effect for the gun rotation, and honestly, it was totally worth it. The next 2 hours or so were then spent on giving some legs to the sentry. I decided that implementing inverse kinematics would take too long, and decided to just opt for some simple maths to move the legs. So I started by adding 4 line objects and making them oscillate. I then offset their oscillation and made the amount of oscillation depend on how parallel they were to the mouse, which doesn't sound easy, and it wasn't. I then added another line to the lines and made it oscillate in a slightly different way, and also decided to add more legs, because why not? Obviously, getting to this point took a lot of iteration and trial and error, but you can probably see what I was going for here. The legs move on the floor and the knees follow them a little, as long as they're not pointed towards the mouse. You can focus on just one leg to understand it a little easier. I made the legs move depending on how fast the sentry was going, but not when it was in the turret mode. After getting the legs to work though, I only had about 6 more hours before the end of the jam, so documentation in the form of recordings slowed down from here on out. The next time I resurfaced from being in the zone, I had created a wave system, which I decided was a much better option compared to the fully randomly spawning enemies. At the start of a round, all the enemies of that round spawn behind random doors, and the player has to avoid and dodge them until the sentry changes to the turret mode. This is repeated until the player destroys all the enemies, at which point the game will wait until the sentry changes to the movement mode and move on to the next round. I also updated the enemy sprites to make them look like actual drones, and made different tiers of enemies, which go up in difficulty and can be identified by the color of their stripe. Some drones also take more than one hit to destroy. I made the sentry take damage from getting hit, which is visualized by a red gradient overlay. The sentry heals after finishing a round, but if it gets hit again in this damaged state, it's game over. The getting hit sound is just a shooting sound pitched down, by the way. I spent some time making walking and dashing sounds, as well as a transformation sound and an alert sound before it. I decided to speed up the mode switch timer if all the enemies were dead, since having to wait 10 seconds for the next round disrupted the pacing of the game. I also finally updated the sprites for the doors. Next, I added a short tutorial with a little bit of world building. I'm definitely the kind of player that prefers a tutorial over being thrown in the deep end, but I also much prefer an integrated, playable tutorial than a wall of text on the download page, because I want my games to be self-sufficient. Both of the friends I playtested this on, however, jumped straight into the game and got the hang of it pretty quickly, so the tutorial is definitely not mandatory, just a nice thing to have. Finally, I added a hardcore mode, which is just like the normal game mode, except the spawns for each round are different and a lot more difficult. I wanted the normal game mode to be at least a little bit playable by people who don't know what WASD means, meaning some of my family members could also try the game out. But that meant it was pretty boring for more experienced players, so the hardcore mode is an actual nail-bitingly tough challenge that'll probably never be beaten in its entirety. Feel free to try though. Finally, I made a really simple menu to choose between these game modes, and it was pretty easy to do using Godot's canvas nodes. So I finished the game on time and uploaded it to itch.io and submitted it to the Ludum Dare website. Submission hour, as well as the next few days, involved me creating a cover image, screenshots, and a promotional GIF for the game, as well as customizing the game's page and making a port for Windows. Some of the feedback I got on the game included that there should have been an option to replay from the last round instead of the start of the game, which I don't fully agree with, but I do think it could have been cool to have a practice mode for something like that. A couple people said the game was too easy, which meant they clearly missed this button, because there's no way you play 5 rounds of this and come to the conclusion that it's just not hard enough. Drone destruction effects were something I literally just forgot about, but I'm not actually too bummed about it. I'm not big on updating my jam games afterwards, half because I like to have them be a representation of what I was actually able to accomplish during the jam, and half because reopening a game jam project is like taking a cheap pair of wired earbuds out of your pocket. Again, if you want to try the game out, you can play it in the browser, and the link to it is in the description.